time for us to check back in with Watermelon Hill and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. And if you'd like to buy this wonderful book, please visit watermelonhillbook.com. And that link will also be in the description below. Home remedies and country doctors. In small-town eastern Kentucky, we didn't have many doctors to choose from and never went to a doctor at all unless it was something very serious. Mom and Dad were our primary doctors, and the fact that we all grew up to be healthy adults is proof that we did eventually get better. Now, I'm not sure if we got better because of their treatments or if we pretended to be better just so we wouldn't have to endure them anymore. I didn't have much faith in most of their treatments, but I didn't have any choice. Today I have a little more faith in some, but not in others. You'll have to make up your own mind. Of course, for a chest cold, there was the inevitable chest plaster with the itchiest piece of wool cloth Mom could find in her collection of quilt scraps. Cotton would not do, not even if it was flannel. It had to be wool. That was one time we would pretend to be better if there was any possible way that we could pull it off. That thing was torture, but we didn't dare take it off until Mom said we could. For coughs or sore throats, we took a homemade concoction that one of my brothers continued to use for his children. Dr. Mom would take a spoon of sugar and drip 2 or 3 drops of kerosene on it. The sugar would soak the liquid right up and mask some of the taste. It seemed to work. Maybe I was a little weird, but I actually liked it. A spoon of sugar with a few drops of turpentine on it was supposed to be a cure for worms, and probably was. It probably poisoned the worms, and with a little higher dosage would probably have poisoned the patient too. Living on a farm and going barefoot approximately half the year, we were always getting cuts from knives, broken bottles, barbed wire, sharp edges of tin roofing, wood splinters, and probably the worst, the occasional rusty nail through the foot. This was a serious wound, and as such rated as one of the most unusual cures, one of the ones I never believed in. Of course, the wound had to be carefully cleaned out and treated, but the treatment didn't end there. The nail had to be treated just as carefully as the foot. Dad would sandpaper all the rust off until it was shining like a new nail, then paint it with iodine and bandage it up like the foot. I don't know what the logic was supposed to be or where it originated, but they believed in it. I don't think any non-burning disinfectant had been invented back then, or if it had, it never made it to Watermelon Hill. There was no such thing as ungentine or neosporin. Mom and Dad usually kept alcohol, mercurochrome, and peroxide in the house, but the preferred disinfectant, which they always had on hand, was iodine. If you have never had iodine swabbed into an open wound, you have an experience to look forward to. It burns only slightly less than a branding iron and keeps burning for much longer than seems possible. It's little wonder that it works. It probably cauterizes all the exposed layer of raw meat. There were also the medications normally used for the animals, which quite often were used for humans too. There was Absorbine, not Absorbine Jr., but the original full-strength horse liniment. The stuff we used the most was a black, stinking coal tar-based ointment used to bring bulls to a head and for various other injuries. It was supposed to be for the horses and cows, but we used it regularly. We used some of the patented medicines like cod liver oil, supposed to be good for what ails you, supplied vitamins, made you grow big and strong, etc., etc., and castor oil for that spring cleaning or whenever Mom or Dad decided it was needed. This was definitely one of the occasions to act like you were feeling fine. If you have ever had castor oil, you understand. If you haven't, you must try it. Enough said. Some of the medicines advertised in the Farmer's Almanac were popular old remedies, like Black Draught, Carter's Little Liver Pills, Lydia Pinkham's Compound, and many others, but I think the only one we used was Black Draught. There was one medicine sold over the counter called Hadacol. It was a tonic that was touted to give your youngster energy, make him feel good and be happy, a regular wonder drug. There was even a comic book back in the 50s about a superhero called Captain Hadacol. This tonic was very popular at that time until it was banned from the market. It seems it was nearly 50% alcohol. Kids were getting stoned on this 100-proof miracle tonic. Things like that are why we have so many controls on medicine today. We need them. Mom made several medicines herself from recipes that had been passed down for generations. One that I really liked was Sassafras Tea. It was not really a medicine, but was used as a spring tonic. It can be made from the complete sassafras root, but the strongest, and what we always used, was made from the bark of the sassafras root. To make the tea, you simply cut the bark, or the root if you're using that, into shavings and boil it in water. I don't remember the proportions, but if it comes out too strong, all you have to do is cut it with more water. If you like regular tea straight, you might like sassafras that way too, but I like it with a spoon of sugar and about 1/3 milk. I haven't had it in some time, but I really enjoy it. I have been keeping my eye out for some place I can buy sassafras roots to make some and share it with friends who have never had it. Some of the homemade medicines were a tad less appetizing than the tea, to say the least. Mom told about another tea Grandma used when Mom was a little girl. When someone got the measles, they would be running a fever, and supposedly the person would begin to recover when the measles completely broke out, spots all over. This tea was supposed to aid in breaking out the measles and thus in a more speedy recovery. Sounds good so far, except the tea was made from dried sheep dung. Mom simply called it sheep tea. Thankfully, we never had sheep on our farm, and I never had measles, so I never got to try it. Whew! One of the strangest medicines was one Mom had made completely from scratch. It was a salve of some sort that I did not experience, but I learned about from my oldest brother. There are some advantages to not living too far back in the good old days. The base for the salve was lard, but not just any old lard. It had to be lard rendered from the fat of a skunk. Mom picked buds from a bush my brother remembers being called balm gilly, probably balm of Gilead. She crushed them and mixed them with the skunk lard to make the salve. It would probably be hard to mass produce, not much skunk fat on the market. They say you can find anything on the internet these days though, maybe on eBay. Most things were treated at home, but not everything. Some things definitely required a doctor. One of my earliest memories was of my brother Jack getting his toes cut off. He was about 12 and I was 4 or 5. He was riding a bicycle in our pasture field, barefoot as usual, along with my brother Curtis and a couple of neighbor boys. Curtis was pedaling the bicycle and Jack was riding on the handlebars. They were going down a hill when Jack's toes got tangled in the spokes of the front wheel. Being on grass, they were unable to stop quickly, so Jack's toes were really mangled by the spokes. When they did get stopped, one of his toes was gone completely. Another was wrapped around the spokes and hanging by a tendon, and the big toe was badly cut. Curtis was so shaken up he couldn't get Jack's toe untangled, so Jack had to do it himself. I remember the boys coming out the road to the house, carrying Jack between them. After the doctor finished severing the dangling toe and sewing him up, Jack was cared for at home. It was the middle of summer and really hot, so Mom made a bed for him in the coolest place in the house, which was in the floor downstairs. The next day, Jack was not doing well at all. He was in extreme pain, and my parents had a strange solution. Dad asked Curtis where the other toe that was completely cut off was. Curtis said it was still out in the pasture field, so Dad made Curtis go find it and bring it to the house. He said it was lying out in the hot sun and it was all curled up. Dad made Curtis straighten the toe out and bury it. Mom and Dad always said that Jack started getting better soon afterwards. To this day, when Curtis sees some boy riding barefoot on the handlebars of a bicycle, he will yell at him to get off there and put some shoes on. I cut my brother's toes off doing that. Some of the old remedies were just superstitions, but others actually worked. All 6 of us kids survived all of the childhood sicknesses and injuries either because of the home remedies or in spite of them. In the 40s and 50s, and certainly before that, there were unfortunately some quack doctors around preying on the desperate or ignorant and promising miracle cures for almost anything, while bilking the poor patient out of their money. There was a doctor who had an office in Louisa, and I believe also in Ashland, Kentucky, who made ridiculous claims for treatments on one of his high-tech electronic miracle machines. He was eventually closed down, but not for years, and not before he made a lot of money from his patients, most of whom could not afford it without hardship. Doctors like that made a mockery of their oath. At the opposite end of the scale were the doctors who were true credits to their profession and would go far beyond the call of duty to treat the sick and needy with no thought for their own comforts or compensation. Most doctors fell somewhere in the middle. The most memorable doctor of my childhood was Doc Burgess. His office was in his home a few miles south of Watermelon Hill on Old Route 23. It was a grand old stone house, or at least it seemed that way to me back then. The story was that the house had been passed down to Doc Burgess and was originally built in the early 1800s by slaves. The walls were a foot or more thick and made from huge blocks of stone. The doc was a truly dedicated man, sometimes spending the night at the patient's house so he could re-examine them in the morning before he left. He cared more about helping his patients than making money from them, and I'm sure he would have treated them just the same whether they could pay or not. He had a 4-wheel drive Jeep so he could get up into the remote hills and hollers to see patients who couldn't come to his office. When I was 5 or 6, I had pneumonia, and Doc Burgess came and spent the night with us to take care of me. I only recently found out the reason for his extreme dedication. While he was serving in the Navy in World War II, his ship was sunk. He was in the water for days, and many of his shipmates died of wounds or dehydration or were taken by sharks, and he could do nothing about it. He prayed that he would survive and swore that if he did, he would devote his life to help and save the lives of others and ease their suffering. Doc Burgess was a man of his word. I wish there were a lot more like him around today. One winter, Dad had pneumonia. Doc Burgess had been to see him, and after treating him, had left him at home to recuperate. 2 of my older brothers and my 2 older sisters were still living at home at the time. We had one cow who did not like anyone except Dad to milk her, but Dad was sick in bed. It was very cold and snowing, so the older kids got stuck with the job. They were gone to the barn for a long time and finally returned without the milk. The cow had kicked and butted them all over the stall and would not let them milk her. They finally just had to give up. Well, if a cow is not milked, she will be in great pain and could actually rupture, so Dad knew she had to be milked no matter what. At the time, Dad was in really bad shape and could hardly breathe from the congestion in his lungs, but despite Mom's protest, he insisted on going to the barn. He bundled up, made it to the barn, milked the cow with no problem, and returned to the house. Surprisingly, instead of Dad's condition worsening, he began to get better. Doc Burgess later told Dad that milking that cow may have saved his life. Moving around as he did had helped break up the congestion. If he had not gone to the barn, he might have lain in bed and died. Sometimes cures come from the most unexpected sources. I feel I need to mention another wonderful old country doctor who happened to be my great-uncle by marriage. He was born December 31st, 1872, and his twin brother was born January 1st, 1873. They were born about midnight and so had the distinction of being one of the few sets of twins who were born in different years. He was named Ulysses Simpson Grant Rice, but did not like his long drawn-out name, and after he grew up just went by Grant Rice. We knew him as Uncle Doc Rice, or just Uncle Doc. He lived too far away to treat our immediate family, but did treat others in the family. Uncle Doc began medical school in 1904 and shortly after graduation returned to Oil Springs in Johnson County, Kentucky, near his boyhood home. This is where he stayed with the exception of 6 years in Slayersville, Kentucky. He is credited with saving many lives during the typhoid fever epidemic soon after he became a doctor and in the great national influenza epidemic of 1918. During the typhoid epidemic, he developed his own remedy for fighting the fever. At a time when most doctors were starving their patients for food and water as a cure, Uncle Doc prescribed cold water. In his own words, "I never gave medicine to reduce fever, but used cold water internally, externally, and eternally." The cure worked. He lost 7 patients while other doctors lost many more. After that outbreak, he went around and gave everyone a shot of vaccine, which stopped the epidemic. Uncle Doc kept good horses and rode them around the countryside to see patients. Often during the epidemics, he would examine the patient, then fall asleep in a chair at the bedside. Like Doc Burgess, he would leave instructions to be awakened so he could re-examine the patient before mounting his horse and continuing his rounds. This was the only rest he got for days and sometimes weeks at a time. He was dedicated to his profession and lost many thousands of dollars on the books because the patient couldn't afford to pay. In his early years as a doctor, Uncle Doc charged 25 cents plus medicine for office visits, $5 plus medicine for house calls, and $5 for delivery of a baby. In his 60 years of practice, he delivered some 8,000 babies. The good doctor lived to the age of 97 and practiced medicine until he was 92. The river. As I mentioned in an earlier chapter, our farm on Watermelon Hill was bordered on the east by the Lavisa Fork of the Big Sandy River, where I daydreamed about riding a raft like Huck Finn all the way to New Orleans. Nice to daydream about, but the river also served some useful purposes. Most of the year, the river was slow, lazy, the very picture of a southern river out of Uncle Remus stories, with a barefoot boy, me, fishing with a cane pole and worms. But in the winter and spring, rains and snows would swell it to a raging torrent, flooding all the fields along the river banks and turning it into a very dangerous stream. During the rainy time of the year, we didn't have much to do with the river, but in the meantime, the river was helping us by depositing a thick layer of rich topsoil on our riverbanks washed down from farms upstream. There was a narrow strip of riverbanks between the steep rock cliffs and the river, hardly a drop in the bucket compared to the farmable land up on the hill, but it grew the best and tallest corn on the whole farm. There was an old road on each end of the farm which curved around the rock cliffs and down to the riverbanks. It was cut out of the hillside by hand. I don't know how long before we moved there and shored up on the downhill side by rocks. It looked very old, even back in the 40s. Between the road on the south end of the farm and the rock cliff were the remains of a stone foundation and chimney for a tiny little house. It was probably a log cabin, but all of the wood had long since rotted away. I was always curious about the people who had lived there. Where did they come from? Where did they go when they left? What sort of people were they? I think they were a family because probably at least 50 years, could have been 100, who knows, after they left, there were still traces of a woman's touch. There were some lilies near the outline of the house in what would have been the minuscule yard. They came up every spring as a memorial to the woman who had tried to beautify her family's undoubtedly rough, drab existence and lift her own spirits in the process. 15 or 20 feet from the back of the cabin, the rock cliffs rose up to the level of the main part of our farm. Growing up, the trees and rocks were the most beautiful vines and sweet-smelling trumpet-shaped flowers you ever saw. I never knew their real name, but we always called them smoke vines. I sometimes felt a little sad when I went past the remains of the old house and usually paused to look around, even though it was always the same. At first glance, you might wonder why they settled halfway down in a gully instead of on the hill, but there was a spring-fed stream running down the bottom of the gully to the river. They probably built near ready drinking water and farmed the riverbanks, which were mostly flat and had rich black dirt. This side of our farm bordered the Capertons, who owned the hill on the other side of the gully. Looking from the top of the cliff, it is almost certain that at one time the two hills were one. Both sides are steep rock cliffs with interlocking pieces that were probably cracked apart by an ancient earthquake. In the edge of the river on the Caperton side were several huge boulders known as Caperton's Rocks and a popular fishing place. They were probably dumped there by the same upheaval. Dad would haul the plows to the riverbanks on a horse-drawn sled, hitch the horses to the plow to till the rich soil, then plant by hand. When the corn was harvested, it was hauled back up the hill to the barn on the same sled. When Dad or some of the boys were working on the riverbanks, Mom would always call them to dinner or supper by ringing the dinner bell. It could be heard to all edges of the farm. As long as we farmed, the old roads to the river were kept passable, but during the 50s, as Dad farmed less and plastered more, they gradually grew up and were barely passable as walking trails. In the summer, when some of the older kids came for a vacation, we usually hacked a path with machetes so that we could get to the river to swim. With no air conditioning or insulation in the house, everyone who had grown soft with city living really looked forward to that one cool, refreshing swim each day. I think it was 1960 when we finally got a telephone. The line continued down over the cliffs and across to the other side of the river. It was a nearly vertical path, but I usually followed the phone line to the river after that because the right-of-way was relatively clear. Still, in the spring, I would sometimes visit the old house site just to see the flowers. There was a family living on the other side of the river, I won't mention their name, who seemed to have no need for a telephone. They just leaned out the door and hollered to the next house or someone working in the fields. The river was a natural sounding board, and from a quarter-mile away, on top of our cliffs, they were clear as a bell. They seemed to argue a lot and were almost always yelling about something or other. Once I was sitting on top of our cliff when one of their young men was following the railroad tracks home and singing at the top of his lungs a song about Barnacle Bill, the sailor. I heard him clearly from a mile or more away when he first came in sight around a curve in the river near Wallbridge until he got home. I don't know, but I thought he might have been to Louisa and possibly across the river to Fort Gay to visit one of their beer joints. He seemed to be feeling pretty good, but he would have probably been singing just as loud even if he had been sober. On the other side of the river and downstream was an oil well that had been pumping for many years. From time to time, people would try to get Dad and Mom to let them drill on our farm, but they valued their privacy and were afraid the drillers would mess up our roads and fields, hauling heavy equipment in. While I was in high school, though, they finally agreed to lease to a wildcat driller to try to find oil. They never found enough to be worthwhile pumping, but I enjoyed hanging around the drilling rig while they were there. The men lived in a little travel trailer and worked 12-hour shifts. Being so close to the river, one of the men had set out a little trot line for catfish and would go down to check it every day. I thought this would be a great opportunity for a prank, so one day I shot a groundhog, and while the driller was working, I hauled in his trot line and hooked the groundhog in the mouth on one of the hooks. I heaved the line back out into the river and waited to hear him tell about the unbelievable catch he had made on his trot line. I guess he saw the bullet hole and knew someone was trying to play a trick on him. He never mentioned it, and I wasn't about to bring the subject up and admit that I was the perpetrator. A railroad bridge crossed the river downstream at Wallbridge, and up into the 50s we could still see steam engines chugging and puffing out their clouds of steam and coal smoke. I could see the trains crossing the bridge from our back porch and went to watch them whenever I could. They would be pulling 150 or more coal cars sometimes. My old neighbor, George Riggs, along with his dogs, had an even better view from his bench high atop his rock cliff. The trains still follow the river past the farm, but they are now all diesel and don't have the romance and nostalgia of the old steam engines. I dropped my bookmark, but we'll stop right there for today. Another interesting peek into Dale's life there on Watermelon Hill. Especially interesting was how these two chapters started with the home remedies. I've always wished I knew more about home remedies. I grew up with things like Granny and Pat believed in using peroxide for everything, still do, so I use a lot of peroxide for different things. Of course, gargling salt water, that one's pretty much really common with most everyone. Not so much the castor oil, although I do remember Granny and Pap taking that, never giving it to us though that I remember. Peppermint would, if you had an upset belly, upset stomach, peppermint would help. So kind of some of those things, but I really enjoyed all the ones that Dale talked about because they were done and gone by the time I was a child. Especially interested is the one about the nail. I've read that in other books that people believed that you should, if you stepped on a nail, then you should take care and doctor the nail too, and somehow that would help your wound heal. I've read that before. That one is really interesting and strange, though. You have to tell me if you've ever heard of that one. I do wish I knew more about medicinal type things. Now, Corey took a class many years ago now where she learned a lot, and so her and Katie both are really interested in that, and they use some of the medicinal things we grow in our yard and make tinctures and stuff that for us to take. A new one we tried last winter was nasturtium, like a tincture made from nasturtiums because it's like a natural antibiotic. So when we were sick, we all took it, and it was kind of like Dale said, I thought it helped, but my goodness, it tasted terrible. It was like the worst thing I've ever tasted in my life. So then you're like, did it help, or did you just want to be better to not have to take any more? Katie makes wonderful calendula oil. I've been telling her she needs to do a video. She's made it for many years now and makes it from the flowers that we grow, the dried ones. And it has such healing power when it comes to burns or scrapes or little cuts or things. It's really, really wonderful. So I wish I knew. It's one of my things I want to learn in the future is just to learn more. Some of our things we grow, me and Corey and Katie kind of look at it as a safety net, like we have it if we ever have to use it. And until then, we'll just enjoy the plants. That's one way of looking at it. I loved the doctors, too, that Dale described. Reminded me, the one that he talked about that took care of him when he was a boy, Dr. Burgess, reminded me of Dr. Paget. So when I was a young girl, that was our doctor that doctored all of us, and he was in Hayesville, and he was the same kind of setup. His house didn't sound as nice as the one Dale described, but he lived in his house. Part of it was his residence, and then part of it was his office, and he was a very old doctor then when I seen him. Very well known in our area, but that was who we'd go to if I had a sore throat or whatever was wrong. That's where I went, and he was very kind, very quiet, wasn't a doctor that talked a lot, at least not to me. As a little girl, he seemed as quiet as I was, but always made me feel better, so I was grateful for that. I really loved the part, too, where Dale was talking about the old home place and how he described that, it might have even been 100 years ago, but how things were still there that showed of a woman's touch, talking about the flowers. It reminded me of so many of the old home places I've seen in my area and in the Smoky Mountain National Park. That's like a telltale sign is when you see those old flowers. Even in driving the roads in the spring and you see where some daffodils are blooming in a strange place, well, somebody planted those and probably there was a house there. You just can't see it anymore, can't see the remains of it anymore. So I love that, and I've always found those kind of places almost always have a really peaceful kind of feeling, like a home feeling, even though it's just like you're like, well, I'm in the middle of the woods now. The woods of nature's took back over. There's still just a feeling of knowing that somebody was once called that home. It just gives me a real special feeling. So I can see why Dale made sure to go back to that place on his farm, on his parents' farm, and visit it. And then really comical about the groundhog. I wish the man, it makes you wonder, did it get off? Did it come off somehow? Or did he just know that it was probably Dale and not mention it? Just kind of like, well, I know it was you and I'm going to not give you the satisfaction of trying to trick me. But that was pretty funny. That would be a shock if you've ever done trot lines. I have not, but I've been around them when Pap done them when I was a girl and when Matt did them. I don't know, in certain places now, I don't know if there's a lot of legalities around them now. But when I was a girl, a lot of those things were probably not in place, and Pap often did that. I think now there's a lot of rules regarding how you do it, and you got to put your name and phone number on it and things like that. But it would have been interesting to see the man's face when he pulled that one up. Like much of the book, the part that I've read today just really makes me wish I could have seen Watermelon Hill. Of course, I wish I could have known Dale and his family. They just sound, wonderful. And I'm so sorry about his brother getting his toes pulled off. That, oh my goodness. I've had bicycle wrecks, but I've never had nothing like that happen. Oh my goodness, the pain and the agony that had to feel for him, and then for his brother feeling bad because even though it wasn't his fault, he was riding he was the one driving the bicycle, and then his parents being worried about him and all that had to be, you can see why that impressed upon Dale's mind and why he never forgot it, and I'm sure his whole family didn't. So I wish I could have known all of them and seen their family interactions, but I really wish I could have seen that beautiful place with those cliffs and the river and the old home place, and in another chapter where he was talking about the place with the big giant beech trees. Beautiful. Makes me wish I could go back there. Of course, Dale's already told us in this book it doesn't look like it did when he was a boy. There's houses, it's a development, totally different than that. But I do wish I could jump back in time and see it through Dale's eyes, see it for myself, see what he shared with us that he's seen through his eyes, see it for myself, because it sounds like such a lovely, lovely place. I hope you're really enjoying the book as much as I am. Please leave a comment and let me know what jumped out at you. Maybe you've had one of those terrible bicycle wrecks like that. I hope not to the point that you lost your toes, though. And always, I hope that you'll drop back by next Friday, so we've got to see what happens next with Dale and Watermelon Hill.